Hello and welcome back. As we continue in our theme about the people and the land, I want to talk a little bit about Tennessee and the influence of agriculture. Probably more than any other form of human activity, you could argue that agriculture itself has influenced and developed Tennessee and shaped the lives of its people in many meaningful ways. You could say that it was the driving force behind the state's settlement. People came to farm on the fertile lands in Tennessee. It was agriculture is a vital factor in Tennessee's economic growth. It's also a major contributor to its wealth, and agriculture is the principal source of household income throughout much of its history, and it serves as a key element in the formation and the continuance of Tennessee's cultural history and heritage. So you could say that agriculture in itself has played a central role, maybe the central role, in the history of Tennessee. So those who came to Tennessee, the early settlements, early settlers, they were able to transform. When they got here, it was an undeveloped wilderness, and they were able to transform the land into mature settlements that would produce high yields of agricultural products. Uh, the settlers sought to create new and productive lives for themselves. That was one point of them coming to Tennessee. They wanted to have a better life for their families, and they wanted to develop the territory's rich farming potential. So settlers, when they first came, they occupied the eastern valleys of the Tennessee and the Holston River systems, as well as the fertile Central Basin area that encircled the Cumberland River. So by the time Tennessee became a state in 1796, these regions already supported substantial agricultural production. And virtually every household, we've talked about this before, virtually every household planted corn as its main source of nourishment because corn was an ideal pioneer crop. It did well on the new fields. It required relatively little care during the growing season. Corn would produce high yields per acre, and it was a staple in the diets of the pioneers. So corn was very important. Wheat and grains were also planted during the first few years, and they'll be important crops. Some settlers brought along animals, and others acquired them from their neighbors or from livestock traders after they arrived at their destination. So the livestock soon supplemented the grain and the vegetable diets with meat and dairy products. Hogs or swine cared for themselves. They survived on the forest most of the year, and their meat could be readily preserved through curing and smoking. So for those reasons, pork was the preferred meat among most farm families. Tennessee's early farm families, valued their self-sufficiency. They worked to supply their families from their own production, and so they were very, very proud people of that. For that, cash crops in Tennessee, those crops that were raised to earn money, consisted of cotton and tobacco, and that has a definite effect on the state, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. So this map here provides a glimpse of major agricultural products, primarily in the South, and you can see Tennessee among those. You can see that cotton throughout the South dominated the lower portion of that purplish color is the cotton production that extends all the way from Texas. This is probably about 1860s, probably prior to the Civil War. I don't have a definite date on the map. You see in the upper South, the gold color that indicates corn. You see much of East Tennessee is in the gold colored region, so corn was very important. The green areas indicate tobacco, and you see middle and West Tennessee, the upper portions of Tennessee were engaged in tobacco. There's tobacco farming also in East Tennessee, but cotton primarily is in the lower middle Tennessee portion and West Tennessee now around the Memphis, around the low Delta regions is where cotton will be grown. And you see the other crops as well that are grown outside of Tennessee. But those are the three main crops that this map indicates that were grown in Tennessee. So this is a photo, obviously, of cotton growing in the field. Cotton was very difficult to harvest by hand because the seeds had to be separated from the cotton fibers. And if you've ever tried to do that, you know how difficult it is to get a hold of those seeds and pull them out of the fibers. So cotton was not an indigenous crop in Tennessee. It wasn't naturally found in Tennessee. And it wasn't really widely cultivated by the earliest settlers in the mountainous regions of East Tennessee. The cotton gin was invented, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later or in a few minutes, but the cotton gin was a machine that was created, developed to separate the cotton feed from the fiber. And these first cotton gins were brought into Middle Tennessee during the 1780s, but they appeared on the estate inventories and tax rolls throughout the state a little bit later on. André Michaux, who was a French botanist, he visited Nashville in 1820, and he spoke enthusiastically about the wealth that could be made from growing and selling cotton. But large-scale cultivation of cotton didn't really begin in the state until the 1820s with the opening of the land between the Tennessee and the Mississippi rivers. The upper wedge of the Mississippi Delta that extends into the southwestern part of Tennessee, this is the fertile section that so-called King Cotton took hold of. But the state's agriculture as a whole was never devoted entirely to growing of cotton, as it was in the other southern states. So there were other cash crops in Tennessee besides cotton. It didn't dominate like it did in the Deep South. Cotton had a seasonal cycle and a work regimen all on its own. It was a specific crop that required specific type of labor surrounding it. Cotton was planted year after year on the same land prior to the Civil War, and therefore it really thrived in the deep, rich soil that West Tennessee offered. And so West Tennessee grew a high grade of cotton with long and heavy staple. So raising and picking cotton demanded a great deal of hand labor, and the crop typically was worked by slave labor prior to the Civil War. The identification of cotton with slavery was central to antebellum agriculture, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later on. So by 1850, Tennessee had held the fifth place. They were ranked fifth among the cotton-growing states in the South, and they benefited from the high revenue that was generated from cotton. Memphis, in fact, laid claim to the title of, quote, the biggest inland cotton market in the world. So Memphis really grew as a result of the growth of cotton. So after the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1794, and you see a picture of the cotton gin here, the yield of raw cotton doubled each decade after 1800. And demand was fueled by other inventions of the Industrial Revolution, such as machines that would spin and weave cotton, the steamboat, of course, to transport the raw cotton to the textile mills. And so by mid-century, America was growing 3/4 of the world's supply of cotton. Most of it shipped to England or New England, where it was manufactured into cloth. And during this time, tobacco fell in value. Rice exports stayed pretty much the same at the same rate. Sugarcane began to thrive, but only pretty much in Louisiana. But by the mid-century in the South, cotton was essentially king, as it was called by some Southern politicians. Whitney didn't really foresee the ways in which his invention of the cotton gin would change society really for the worse, because it increased the need for slave labor. There's going to be a growth of slavery because of it. And while it's true that the cotton gin reduced the labor of removing the seeds, it didn't reduce the need for slaves to grow and pick cotton. So just the opposite occurred. Cotton growing became so profitable for the planters that it greatly increased their demand for both the land and for slave labor. So, because of the cotton gin, slaves now labored on an ever larger plantations where the work was more regimented and more relentless. And as large plantations began to spread into the Southwest, the price of slaves and land inhibited the growth of cities and industries in the South. And so that's why the Northeast began to grow exponentially. Immigrant workers would come to the Northeast for manufacturing jobs. They didn't immigrate to the South because they didn't want to compete with slave labor, and the South was based primarily on agriculture. So when the early settlers came to Tennessee and they began to work the land, the production of tobacco was one of the first cash crops planted. And since those early days, tobacco is grown in about 66 of the state's 95 counties. Now, I'm not sure how old that statistic is, but it's modern times. Tobacco is still grown in 66 of the state's 95 counties. Burley tobacco is grown in all of these 66 counties, with 8 counties producing what's called dark-fired tobacco. And through the years, tobacco has ranked among the top 5 leading cash crops in the state and has ranked number 1 on several occasions for Tennessee. Until about 1924, burley tobacco was primarily grown only in the eastern portion of the state, where the smaller hillside farms made tobacco production pretty natural choice. Demand and the need for diversification, though, brought tobacco production to Middle Tennessee. And burley tobacco is used primarily in cigarettes for its flavor and its combustible quality. After it's harvested in the fall, burley is hung up and cured simply by the air flowing through it. So you see the picture here of the tobacco hanging up in the barn there being cured. Dark-fired tobacco is different because it goes into the smokeless tobacco, such as chewing tobacco and snuff. And when it's harvested, it has to be cured with heat inside the barn. So the dark-fired tobacco is hung up, and the floor of the barn, on the floor is there's hardwood sawdust spread out, and slabs of oak or hickory, and the tobacco is fired. So there's a process to that, and it has to be a very careful process because you don't obviously want to burn your barn down. But it's a tedious process because if you have too much heat, it'll destroy, as I said, the barn, and it will destroy your tobacco crop. And too little heat in the dark fired tobacco if you don't have enough heat, it causes the tobacco to mold. So there's a process there involved in that. The bulk of the dark fired production tobacco is in middle and northwestern part of Tennessee. Both types of tobacco, either the burley or the dark fired, it requires a tremendous amount of hand labor. And in the antebellum period, due to the soil, the climate, and the terrain conditions, regions of specialization emerged throughout Tennessee. So let's talk a little bit about slavery in Tennessee. During the frontier years in the 1760s, Anglo-American frontiersmen were determined to settle the land, and they brought their slaves with them into what will become Tennessee. And over time, East Tennessee, because of the smaller farms, due to the terrain, the hilly, mountainous regions, East Tennessee will retain the fewest number of slaves in the state. Middle Tennessee, where tobacco and cattle and grain became the favored crops, Middle Tennessee is going to hold the largest number of slaves throughout the antebellum period. In West Tennessee, the area between the Tennessee and the Mississippi rivers, West Tennessee ultimately will have the richest cotton producing part of the state, and they're going to see West Tennessee is going to have the greatest concentration of slaves within their area. But Middle Tennessee is going to have the largest number of slaves, and West Tennessee will have the greatest concentration of slaves. So by 1860, Tennessee had about 275,000 slaves, just under 25% of the total population. And these slaves were engaged in urban, industrial, and agricultural slavery. In looking at the early statehood years in terms of slavery, When North Carolina gave up its western lands to the United States in 1790, the terms of this cession prevented the new federal Congress from excluding slavery in the Southwest Territory. That's what Tennessee, if you remember from your reading, Tennessee is formed out of the Southwest Territory. So one of the stipulations was in North Carolina giving this land up to the U.S. government was that slavery could not be excluded. And the country at this time was governed under the Articles of Confederation. And if you remember from maybe one of your U.S. history courses, you probably will know that the Northwest Territory, slavery had been excluded in that region, but the Southwest Territory, there was a provision that kept it from being excluded. 6 years later, when Tennessee achieved statehood in 1796, the Constitution, and we'll look at these constitutions, but Tennessee's first constitution remained somewhat quiet on the status of slavery. The state operated under the laws first proclaimed by North Carolina, whereby slaves were regarded primarily as chattel, that is, the property of their owners, but sometimes as persons with legal obligations and very few legal rights. Slaves, for example, had the right to a jury trial in exceptional cases of crime that were outside of their master's jurisdiction. Slaves also had the right to contest their ownership in the courts if they could present evidence and get a white person to sponsor them. They could bring this case to court. At the same time, as in all the slave states, the marriage of slaves and the right to their children had no legal sanction. So here's a series of maps that show the correlation of slavery and cotton production. It's a little bit hard to understand at first, but once you know what you're looking at, it really is a very insightful graphic. If you look, well, as cotton becomes more profitable, the need for cheap labor, the need for slave labor is going to grow, as I mentioned earlier. If you look at the top left map, it represents the slave population in 1820, and each one of the red dots is equal to 200 slaves. So you see most of the concentration of slaves are pretty much on the East Coast, the tidewater areas of Virginia, and the areas of South Carolina and Georgia. The bottom left, right below that map, represents cotton production in 1820. So one dot equals 1,000 bales of cotton. So you see from the bottom left, in 1820, cotton production had not really taken off that much. Now, Tennessee, you see Middle Tennessee has some dots there for cotton, but it really wasn't a dominant crop as of 1820. If you look at the top right map, this represents the slave population in 1860. So 40 years it's a 40-year span between these two sides. But 1860, top right, one dot is equal, again, to 200 slaves. And you can see the concentration of slaves has really spread throughout the South. And then right below that, you see in the bottom right, represents cotton production in 1860. So one dot equals 1,000 bales of cotton again. So you can see how once the western lands open up in Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, cotton is going to spread westward, and slaves are going to be brought westward. So as cotton grows, the need for slavery also grows with it. So that's what that graphic illustrates.
So the graphic you see here is slavery in Tennessee based on statistics from the 1860 census. And it shows the breakdown of slaves, slave owners, white population, and percentage of slaves in each section in Tennessee. And so you see with East Tennessee, there are over 27,000 slaves, constituting almost 10% of the slaves in the state. Middle Tennessee has over 146,000 slaves. This makes up nearly 29% of the slave population. And then West Tennessee has 101,000, over 101,000 slaves, making up about 34% of the slaves in the states. So this is a breakdown that shows you how where the slaves were located in correlation to the state, to the regions of the state. Now, most slaves, both male and female slaves, were agricultural workers. And slavery really wasn't a uniform experience throughout the state. And really, you could say that throughout the entire South. You can't take one experience and apply it uniformly to every experience in the South. So it's really a farm by farm basis. On the farm, a slave's life was influenced by the kind of operation that his or her master ran. It depended upon whether or not it was a subsistence farm, maybe a corn and tobacco cash crop farm, a livestock farm, a cotton plantation, or a combination of each of these. Also, the number of slaves that a master housed helped to determine the shape of any given slave community. Relatively few large plantations existed in Tennessee as they did in the Deep South. And census records from Tennessee show that only one person owned more than 300 slaves in 1860 in the state, and 47 owned more than 100. So more than 3/4 of all slave holders in the state of Tennessee held fewer than 10 slaves. Together, they controlled about 40% of the slave population. So by 1860, more than half of the slaves probably lived in quarters that housed more than 10 but fewer than 100 slaves in the state of Tennessee.
As far as life for slaves on the farm, the work assignments were dictated by the seasonal need of the master's farm, by the domestic needs of the household, and often by the needs of the plots assigned to those slave families to provide a portion of their subsistence. Some slaves, especially those with special talents like carpenters or weavers or musicians, were hired out to other plantations or sometimes to town residents. Generally, slaves were housed in family units rather than in a barracks style housing, and this undoubtedly reinforced the sense of family that prevailed in the slave quarters, despite the way in which slavery itself was so oppressive and often destroyed the family unit. Religion also served as a strong survival mechanism. Slaves adopted and adapted Christianity. Frontier Methodist and Baptist churches were open to slavery, or open to having slaves as part of their denominations that other churches were not open to. Methodist circuit riders, for instance, preached to whites and blacks, and they eagerly claimed their black converts. Within the slave quarters, there are slave preachers who emerged from the community, and they interpreted Christianity, and it was a very powerful unifying force in the slave quarters. Also, in the slave quarters, there's a powerful form of spiritual music that was created among the slaves. This musical response to the hardship that the people were facing provided the slaves with solace, with hope, and with solidarity. And it also has left a historical record for modern historians to study. These slave spiritual that have remained provide clues into the lives that slaves, what they faced and how they lived. And despite the fact that some slaves, it was against the law to teach slaves to read and write, there are many who learned how to read and write without the cooperation of their individual masters. And so sometimes the slaves fashioned a world of their own within the white masters' farms and plantations. Slave owners were often conscious of this slave community that was developing outside of their influence, and in some sense independent of them. But many slave owners usually chose to ignore what they couldn't control. So they knew there was a unique slave community that was emerging on their plantations and their farms, but most of the time they didn't interfere with that. Urban slavery produced another set of experiences for blacks In most towns and in larger cities, slaves were scattered throughout the community. Most of the time, they were visible at many public events. Slaves provided the basic manual labor in the city and much of the skilled labor as well. There were also industrial workers. Small textile plants advertised for workers in the early 19th century. Mines and grist mills also used slave labor, and they sometimes would hire slaves to work for them. In terms of post-Civil War agriculture, the Civil War had really been especially destructive on the cotton farming market. Tennessee's output 50 years after the war was still well below what it had been in 1860. Following emancipation, West Tennessee cotton planters needed a new labor system to replace slavery. And so for the next 60 years, the sharecropper system dominated the region. And this was just another form of slavery, except it went by a different name. Most of the sharecroppers were African Americans. They worked for one half or one third of the cotton crop. And from what they received, of course, then the landowner would deduct the cost of the seed, the cost of mules, and supplies that had been advanced to the sharecropper by the landlord at the start of the season. So sharecropping is going to really hold the South back from developing. There's other challenges, particularly in the cotton market, that farmers face. One of which was the boll weevil. You see pictured here. This destructive little beetle ate up a lot of the cotton crop, destroyed it. Another challenge was the fact that many blacks began to migrate from the south to the north. Also, the farm markets began to collapse after the 1920s. Farming was going into a deep depression. In 1927, the Mississippi River flood destroyed quite a bit of the cotton crop. And then there was 3 years after this, there's a severe drought that killed the crop. Of course, in the worst depression in history, the Great Depression, there's going to be problems with the cotton crop during that decade. And then, of course, then the New Deal came in, and the crop was reduced because there was low prices. It was a way of trying to bring the prices up and trying to restore the cotton market. So the New Deal had reduction programs. So all these things together transformed the old labor-intensive and tenant-based system of farming. So here is pictured an example of a contract of a landowner and his sharecroppers. And in this case, this is James Mitchell was the landowner, and he had hired some of his former slaves. Richard and Mary were his slaves who had worked on his farm. And so then after the 13th Amendment, when slavery was ended, Richard and Mary are still living on the same piece of land as they had when they were slaves, but now they're sharecroppers. And so they have a contract with their former master, James Mitchell. And essentially, as I said earlier, sharecropping, it was essentially slavery by another name. You can see here from I don't know if you can make this out or not. It's kind of hard to read, but I've transcribed it. Basically what it says is, we, the undersigned, have this day agreed to hire to James Mitchell for the year 1866 for the following considerations, vis-a-vis 2 bales of cotton, 500 each, 10 barrels of corn, 5 barrels of wheat. Said James Mitchell is to furnish us in clothing. Also, we are to pay our own doctor's bill. We also agree to do any kind of labor, said James Mitchell, may deem necessary outside of the crop, and at all times obeying strictly the institution of the same service to commence January 1st, 1866, close December 25th, 1866. So it's a contract, it's a worker's contract, but they're pretty much doing the same job they had been doing as slaves. They are receiving a share of the crop, but they are tied to the land, and so they're not ever able to leave. And you see that, of course, Richard and Mary, they can't sign their name. They've made their mark beside of their names. But this is what one of the sharecropper documents would look like. So moving into the 20th century in terms of the role of agriculture, generally from about 1900 to 1940, Tennessee agriculture would experience some short-lived prosperity, but then followed by stagnation and economic hardship. There were some improved markets during the First World War. There was a temporary expansion of cotton, tobacco, and wheat production. However, world surpluses after the war soon drove the prices down to below the pre-war levels, and it caused declines in cotton and tobacco acreage in the 1920s. Shortages during the Second World War gave rise to a lucrative new crop, and that was soybeans. The development of a wide array of new soybean-based products after World War II fueled an enormous increase in both domestic and foreign demand. Tennessee farmers responded by increasing their output from 1949 up to 1992, making soybeans the state's most valuable crop. They also devoted more of their resources to livestock, especially beef and dairy cattle and swine or pigs. And because the state was well endowed with grasslands and animals required less labor than field crops, livestock really provided an attractive alternative to cotton and tobacco. When domestic demand for meat and dairy goods soared in the prosperous post-war years, Tennessee really benefited from this. And farmers continued to cultivate a variety of commercial grains, primarily wheat and corn. There was improvements in the packaging, transportation, and the distribution of perishable items. And some Tennessee farmers moved into large-scale production of fruits and vegetables. And during the post-World War II era, Tennessee farmers participated in a nationwide agricultural revolution that generated many far-reaching changes throughout the country. And the driving force behind the revolution was the adoption of highly sophisticated new technology. The internal combustion engine tractor was arguably the most critical and crucial innovation on Tennessee farms. Tractors began to appear on the farms even before the Second World War, but then after the war, Tennessee farmers adopted using the tractor more readily and at an accelerated pace. And in time, the tractor completely displaced mules and horses that were used to plant the fields, plant and harvest. Machinery, for the most part, took their place. And although the initial investment, it was more expensive to buy a tractor, tractors cost less to maintain, they delivered more power, and they were more dependable than draft animals were. Most importantly, though, tractors substantially reduced the need for farmhands. This was a critical factor in the period of rising labor costs following the Second World War. In addition to mechanical innovations, farmers also took advantage of biological and chemical developments. They adopted new strains of cotton, tobacco, corn, wheat, grain, sorghum, and vegetables, which offered higher yields, superior quality, and better adaptability to weather and soil conditions. They used synthesized fertilizers, which delivered a greater range and larger amounts of nutrients to the soil, allowing them to produce a better product. The entry of corporate enterprise into farm management was yet another aspect of the post-World War II transformation. Business firms sometimes provided supplies and services to farmers in return for contracted production of marketable commodities, and they sometimes purchased land and equipment and went into production on their own. In Tennessee, so-called agribusiness, as these corporate arrangements have been labeled, became most common in poultry and specialized fruits and vegetables. And despite an enduring commercial orientation, farming has, from the beginning of settlement in the 18th century to the present, it has played a broader cultural role in Tennessee. And many rural residents have viewed farming as a way of life and as a social organization for perpetuating worthwhile values. Although they never precisely define the subsistence of that life or of those values, they emphasize being independent, having family cohesion, community sharing and cooperation, and working the land. So nobody really ever spells these things out, but this is the kind of idea that many rural residents view. This is how they view farming, as a cohesive part of the community. Here I've provided a graphic of Tennessee's top crops within recent years. You see soybean production is at the top, and there's corn, cotton, tobacco, and wheat. Those are all important commodities that Tennessee produces. And then on this next slide, I have the top livestock that's produced: cattle, chickens, dairy, swine, and goats. So this is all part of the agricultural production in Tennessee. So that pretty much rounds up what I wanted to say about agriculture in Tennessee and the effects that it had on the development of the state and the people in the state. So I appreciate your attention, and I will speak to you again very shortly.